From B Media Production, this is B Podcasting. Engage your audience with podcasts.
It's not an overly expensive way of branding something that's long-term. And most of these podcasts are evergreen, so you can listen to them whenever, and they make good reason. You can always go back to that brand proposition.
That's Andy Hayes, CEO of podcast advertising network Placard Media, on the rise of podcast advertising and how brands can get involved. Hello and welcome to episode 18. I'm Nick Schildberger. First, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host and podcast aficionado, Chris Ashmore.
Hello, Nick. Look, I wanted to talk about show notes this episode. James Cridland, he was on episode 1, has put together an analysis of 19 podcast apps and their show notes, how they display them.
There's a lot of podcast apps now.
I know, it's incredible. But there are huge inconsistencies in the way the apps display their show notes. And in summary, 5 out of 5 marks are given for Pocket Casts, Overcast, Castro, Player FM, Radio Public, Beyond Pod and Castbox. The links all work. Line breaks, accented characters and formatting are all displayed properly. Now, your favourite podcast app, Apple Podcasts.
Just before you give their score, I do want to just apologise for what I said last episode in my review of the new iOS 11 Apple Podcast app, because I was fairly scathing. I have been using it a little bit, and it's not quite as bad, perhaps, as with all things. We don't like change, and I'm becoming more familiar with how it works. I would like them to put the duration on the summary page so you can see. And I still can't quite tell which ones are downloaded. But if you ignore that, I'm enjoying it a bit more now.
Oh, that's good to hear. You don't have to apologise. You can be scathing. That's all right. But back to James Cridland's analysis. He gives Apple Podcasts 3.5 out of 5.
Oh, I don't feel so bad then.
There you go. There's still a long way that they can do to improve things. But he says only when searching are URLs clickable. Other links are ignored. Formatting is ignored. It's only when you subscribe to the show does everything work. So not everyone subscribes to everything on Apple Podcasts. You might just want to listen to an episode, and if you do, you can't click on the URL, and the formatting's all lost. So 3.5 out of 5. Stitcher. Now, incidentally, I've got a bone to pick with Stitcher. Recently, it took a week to upload an episode for some of our podcasts. That's not good enough, without an explanation until we asked about it. We'll give them the benefit of the doubt. Perhaps it won't happen again. But James gives them 2 out of 5 for show notes. No links are clickable. No formatting or line breaks are respected or displayed. And that's the same with Spotify and a podcast app called Podcast App. Both get 2 out of 5.
I guess Stitcher and Spotify were never built for podcasts, so I guess that sort of might explain why they're a bit behind still.
No excuse.
No
excuse.
I know. Fix it. Fix it.
In summary, always show links with the URL visible. Even if they're not clickable, at least they're visible. So that means http://www.be.com.au rather than just business essentials as a word. Bold text, line breaks, dot points, any of those other formatting HTML codes may be lost in a lot of apps. So just be aware. If you want other tips on show notes, well, email us and we're happy to help.
Can I ask one question first? Or do I have to email you? I want to know, though, with all these apps, do you actually upload to the show notes individually to each of these apps, or is there a way of it being spread out?
Oh, good question. Good question. Best practice is using a podcast hosting platform, and you would do the show notes once there. You might want to do it again in your own web page if you're, got a link to your webpage, which I encourage you to do. If you have it in the hosting platform, it will automatically get uploaded to iTunes or to the other podcast apps. So just the one time's fine.
Now, let's move on to today's feature interview. What's the topic?
In the United States, podcast advertising revenue has been estimated to grow to $220 million this year from $69 million in 2015. That's more than 300% growth in 2 years. The people we speak with, we've heard this throughout this podcast, Nick, they say we're a couple of years behind the United States, so surely the advertising dollars will come our way too. It's not happening yet, but surely it'll happen. One person who thinks so is Andy Hayes. He's founded Placard Media to introduce advertisers with his stable of podcasts here in Australia. The growth, he says, has been steady and he's bullish about the future. Here's the interview. Well, Andy Hayes, can you first tell me a little bit about your background and why you started Placard Media?
Yeah, sure, no problem. So I'm a management consultant by background. So unlike most people who are in the industry right now, I come from no media experience, but I come from a business experience of helping large companies with strategic thinking. The reason we started the business, and I must say I have a business partner who's in Auckland, Andrew Shaw, and the reason we started the business is we are both long-term podcast listeners, been listening for maybe about 7 or 8 years, and over the last 24 months or so, more and more American content, and we're listening to them. We're hearing a lot of adverts. We're hearing a lot of Casper mattresses, a lot of Blue Apron. And I got a little bit annoyed at it. I know a lot of people in the podcasting industry here before we ever decided to start the business, and they're doing amazing things. We've got some unbelievably talented creators in Australia, and there really wasn't any way for them to be supported. So we looked at it and we said, look, we know a lot of people, they're struggling, they want to make their podcast, but they've also got, a life outside of podcasting. And they're looking to get into it in a bigger way. So we decided to start the business. And that was it. We sat down one day, had a beer back in December last year and said, hey, we can solve this problem. And so we set about to solve the problem. And so far, kind of 10 months later, we're working with 90 podcasts. We've got a roster of about 40 brands that we work with regularly. And it's going well.
Well, it's always good to have a beer and chew on the world's problems.
I feel like that's where the best ideas come from. You may not get to fruition, but they certainly get made there.
Absolutely. Well, you say you've got 90 podcasts. How have you found those podcasts? Have they come to you, or you've been searching far and wide?
In the early stages, we went and we sought podcasts, and I talked to a lot of the podcasters I knew and said, hey, do you want to come on this journey with us? And the answer was resoundingly yes. As we built and we had more content and we had more brands on board, we needed to grow. And we've been fairly active in the community. So helping establish the first Melbourne Podcasters meetup, putting ourselves out there, generally attending events, being active in the online forums. So we've now got a piece where we still search out podcasts because there's some great ones out there that we want to work with. And when we hear them, we will contact them and go after them. But on the similar side, we now have probably 5 to 10 podcasts contacting us a week, saying, hey, this is what we do, this is our show, this is the numbers that we have. Would you be interested in talking to us? And the answer is always interested in talking to people.
Absolutely. Well, what about the client side? Has it been difficult to find advertisers?
In the early stages, absolutely. So we spent a huge amount of time doing roadshows. So going out and seeing the media agencies, going out and seeing the brands directly, using contacts from our previous experience and saying, hey, this is a medium that you should be in and this is a channel that your marketing team should be looking at. So it has been a challenge, but over the last 6 months, and there's more people in the industry now. So while we're a dedicated podcast agency, we don't do technology, we don't do those pieces. There is other companies that do both. And, all of us together and the industry as a whole from advertising and podcasts is starting to knock down the doors. So people are getting interested and they're coming to us now, whereas before we had to chase every brand. Now we're getting probably 2 brands a week coming to talk to us.
With the advertisers, do they often ask you questions about analytics and the reach of the ads in the podcasts? Are ads measurable? And if so, how?
So I think there's a couple of pieces there. We do get asked by advertisers about reach. Podcast advertising is really starting to grow, but it's straddling a world, particularly in the media agencies, between digital and traditional media. So when there's a traditional media buyer that's in charge of the campaign, they're more concerned about general reach. So what numbers can you give me? Okay, well, we're going to give you 20,000 or 40,000 or 60,000 or 80,000 over the length of the campaign. And it's a bit easier to work that way. When some of the newer agencies, podcasting, because it's a digital medium, even though it's audio, is seen and is managed by the digital teams who are used to buying Facebook and Google and LinkedIn ads. And obviously the analytics that comes with those is a lot deeper because everyone has to sign in, everyone has to register, and it's a geo-targeting piece, it's an age and a demographic piece, you get a whole lot more information. So it depends on who the buyer is. We work as close as we can, and with Omni, for an example, with the podcasts, and about 60% of our podcasts are with Omni, we can get some amazing analytics in terms of, listen through drop-off rates, where they are, and we provide all of that. But again, we're still probably playing in a reach game. So it's maximum numbers, maximum impact, which isn't always potentially the correct way to go when you're advertising on a podcast, but it is certainly a way to go. From a measurable point of view, Yes, they are. My feel is that they are. So not only do we have the reach numbers, which we know, and good hosts will do a lot of work on good analytics. And we've seen some of these things out of the States at the moment where there's some trouble with that. But good hosts will focus on good analytics. So we can give reach, we can give location, we can give device, we can give some really detailed information. But it's also measurable when we go back to pieces where people didn't really like, which is kind of the call to action or the direct marketing response. So, a website / podcast name. And we are seeing that is a response. So we work with podcasts on that, and it is probably the best way to measure it. Either that or it's a link in the show notes out to a landing page. It's never going to be the same, or not in the short term anyway. It's not going to be the same as your Facebook and Google, where you've got that rate and you can follow someone around the internet using cookies. And that will change as Google starts banning out cookies. But it is measurable. It's a different type of measuring. And if you think about radio today, radio still works on paper diaries. It still works on phone calls and listener surveys to see what the points are.
Right.
So it's a lot more measurable than people would think when you compare against radio
or other media.
Exactly. You've got outside advertising where people buy on someone there with a clicker saying, well, we think there's going to be 300,000 people who walk past that advert today, so it's this price. We're actually giving concrete analytics on the number of times that podcast has been listened to.
Well, what kind of advertisers do you have? Are you allowed to reveal that?
Look, I'll keep some of the brand names away, but
Sure.
We work with a really wide range, and it's been really exciting over the last 12 months about where these advertisers are coming from. When we started, we decided, look, we'll just take the American model and we'll go after the internet-based companies, I guess is the best way to describe them. And that worked absolutely. But where we've got universities, we've got book publishers, we've got movie companies, we've got banks, we've got insurance companies. So it's much wider now than we probably ever thought it was going to be. So they're coming from everywhere. And the spend is different and the want is different. Some people want to dip the toe in the water as part of a bigger marketing strategy. And that's exactly where podcasting should be. It should be part of your bigger media buy and as part of your channel distribution. But it's been really exciting about where the various advertisers are coming from.
Are there independent podcasters now that can make some serious money from podcasting, or is it still a long way to go for them to give up the day job to do it?
Yeah, look, I think there's some, we work with a couple of great networks, Nearly Network, Planet Broadcasting, where they're doing that as their job. And they'll admit freely that they have a way to go. We do have some independent podcasters that we work with where, from a monetary point of view, they're making a good living, but whether it's full-time or not for them is a different piece. We have a lot of people who've taken the jump and said, look, we're going to go full-time on this. And that's them, we support them where we can. It's got a long way to go to be America, where you've got the fabled numbers of Mark Maron and those guys, or My Favorite Murder, where the money is enormous.
But they've got the audience as well. They've got a huge market.
They do, but I guess one of the things is everyone says that America is a huge market, but podcasting is limitless. There's no boundaries unless your content is really, really specific. We have a number of amazing Australian podcasts that are very, very big in America, and they make a good living off the American market. So you don't have to be in America to make a living out of a podcast. I think that's one of the things that people get caught up on is that, oh yes, but Mark Maron's in America. So what? We've got Will Anderson here who makes a great podcast with Charlie Clausen, and they're here, and they've got a great reach. There is a long way to go for people to make hundreds of thousands of dollars off podcasting every year, from an independent podcaster. But there's certainly money in it if you've got a decent show, you've got good content, you're passionate, you're consistent with your release, and your numbers are starting to grow, then you can absolutely make some money, not just to cover your costs, but to, increase your equipment or whatever it might be. And then the other side is that we're seeing a huge growth in, and something that we're working on is the live touring aspect. We have a lot of comedians and a lot of good business shows, a lot of sports shows that are looking at live shows to supplement where they're going. And it reaches a new audience, and it also connects you with that community. And the community around a podcast is the most important thing for growth.
If we look at the ads themselves in podcasts, how do you advise on presenting the ads? Is a host-read ad better, or is a generic pre-recorded ad better, or it just depends on the podcast?
So we focus primarily on host-read ads. From my point of view as a long-term podcast listener, I like to be in the flow of a show, and if somebody wants to sell me something in the middle but it's in their voice, and then I'm generally okay with it. There's some great examples, the famous Bill Burr, he does some amazing ads. He did Sherry's Berries, which kind of almost started podcast advertising. Host read, we feel, gives a true connection. So you'll hear the same terms over and over again from people, is that it's authentic, it's in the host's voice, there's a trust relationship between the host and the audience, and that's really important. And we think that's what you're buying. Mm-hmm. You're buying that trust relationship. So you're not just buying reach on some of these podcasts, which is great, but you're buying that trust relationship. And we know from the figures that are coming out of America, and they're starting to do more research in Australia, that kind of 65% of people will go and at least have a look at the website, or not, if not buy something from a podcast advert. So we focus on host read. There is a space in the market for dynamic insertion or radio ads or recorded ads, and there's a time and a place. And we do it in certain occasions, but right now our entire focus is on host read because we believe that gives the brand the most value for money.
What do you think of branded podcasts?
I'm in favour of branded podcasts because I think they can produce some incredible content. One of my favourite shows of the last little while, particularly when you're on a journey starting out in your own podcasting company or whatever it might be, is the Gimlet eBay Open for Business podcast. I thought it was hugely informative. It was really well done. eBay's not overly pushed in it, but you can certainly know that it's an eBay product. I think there's an absolute place for them. It's about doing it correctly. It's about doing it within your brand guidelines. It's about making that connection. So I found that podcast, the Microsoft.net podcast with Gimlet, the Hootcast from Hootsuite, they're all really informative, but they're in the line of business where they need to be. So I think there's a real space for them. I think it's going to grow exponentially over the next 12 months because it's not an overly expensive way of branding something that's long-term. And most of these podcasts are evergreen, so you can listen to them whenever, and they make good reason. You can always go back to that brand proposition.
Now, controversial question, Andy. The ABC, it's building quite a portfolio now in podcasting. Is that a good thing for the industry, or is their collection taking potential audiences away from the likes of independents and commercial podcasts?
I think it can only be a good thing at this point of podcasting's trajectory in Australia. We're getting there. The ABC did some research that they released at AusPod, the Australian Podcast Conference, I think it was in September, where a staggeringly high percentage of people in Australia now know what a podcast is. That's down to some great independent podcasting, but it's also down to the advertising push from the ABC. So the $1 million fund that they've got is a fantastic thing. Now, whether they gobble up some podcasts that are already existing and put them under the ABC brand, or whether they actually go ahead and take the risk of commissioning some podcasts, they release the guidelines. They're interesting. They want people to work in a certain way. I think from a recognition point of view, it's great. What their risk is that they don't have another Science Versus where they decide, look, I can't do what I want to do with my brand, my podcast, what I'm doing, and they try and leave. And if you look at the guidelines around what they're doing, that's going to be increasingly difficult. But it's a fantastic thing for the industry as a whole. The more podcasts we have, the better. Independent podcasts will always find a home. They will always find a home with a listenership if you're good enough.
Where do you see podcasting, say, in the next 12 months or beyond that?
It's a really, really exciting time. We have lots of companies that have moved into the market, be it Podcast One with SCA, be it Acast. We've got ABC with their $1 million fund. We've got a number of independent producers and networks making great content. What we have right now is everybody trying to find their place. And as you would expect, if you go back, and you've probably had it on here a couple of times now, it kind of goes back to when blogging started and everyone was trying to blog and everyone was trying to find their piece, and eventually it started to tighten up. We're going to see more independent podcasts. The number is growing from the amount of people that contact us every week. I can see that it's growing. I think the branded podcast is going to become bigger and bigger. We're going to see bigger players. We already have, but we're going to see them continue. So the likes of your Fairfax and your SCAs and your Macquaries moving more into that space as radio shrinks a little bit. They're going to use digital or podcasting to maintain or grow where they are, grow their presence, and allows them to do things that they can't do on radio. Really heavy journalistic stuff. You can see, Dirty John coming out of LA Times. It's going to allow journalists to do those kind of things. So we're going to see more and more of that. We're going to, as I said, we'll see a huge spike, or we'll continue to see a spike in the independents. And it could be 12 months, it might be 24, it might be 36, where we start seeing the market settle and contract, and people either merging or people saying, all right, well, there's not enough space, and we'll find kind of where we need to be within that time. And the advertisers, obviously, from our point of view, over the next 36 months, should grow exponentially. We look at the American market, the fabled 250 million or 222 million that it's going to be next year. We only need a tiny slice of that in Australia, considering market size. And I think we'll see that over the next period, whether it be branded, whether it be host-read, or whether it be taking the radio-produced ads or the audio-produced ads and popping them in. We'll see a growth in that. And so the podcast listener needs to be expecting that to happen.
Well, I love your enthusiasm. Andy, thank you so much for being on the program.
No
It was
problems.
good talking to you.
Thanks, Chris.
Gee, he's passionate, isn't he?
Oh, he is. He is. He's someone who is not a podcaster. He's not an engineer. He's not a producer. He's a business person, and he sees an opportunity here with podcasting to make some money. So, I can see why he's excited about it. It's great. It's great what he's doing.
Yeah, and supporting the Australian podcasting landscape as well, which is good. And while he's making money, hopefully he'll be making money for others as well.
That's right. One point, measuring audience numbers. It's hard for any media and all, salespeople, advertising sales in TV and radio. They're always pushing for companies to advertise with them. And it's something that's hard to measure, but probably easier to measure in podcasts. Yet so many people say, well, what's the return on investment? What are your thoughts?
Well, he talked about reach and measurability, which I guess are two separate things. The reach side, as he explained, if you upload to a good platform, you've got excellent analytics. So there's not really any excuse for not knowing where your podcast is going, where in the world, what they're listening on, how much they're listening to each episode. So there's some really good analytics there on the reach side. The measurability side, which is the question we always get asked about return on investment, is a trickier one. But I agree with you that it's probably easier in podcasts because it's more appropriate to give a direct call to action or send people to a website from a podcast than you can on a billboard or a page in a print magazine. So there are some ways you can measure exactly what is going on by having a call to action.
Yeah. But the recall of advertising or sponsorship in a podcast, we've spoken to Mamma Mia, Kylie Rogers, earlier this year, how they get 80% recall from their audience members with a sponsored piece in a podcast. That's incredible. If you think of, whether you read the newspaper yesterday or a magazine, can you remember of the 100 ads that are in there, can you remember, a collection of 2 or 3? I mean, you just can't.
So it's Spring Carnival in Melbourne, so I've seen a lot of betting ads, but beyond that, no, you don't.
That's right. So 80% recall in Mamma Mia's podcasts, that's pretty good.
Well, Midroll in the US, who are the biggest advertising platform for podcasting, they claim, I think it's about 61 or 62% of people who listen to an ad in a podcast say they're likely to buy from that brand. So again, there's some measurement being done on the effectiveness of ads. And as Andy said, he talked a lot about, host-read ads working better than other ads. And again, it's that comparing it to radio where you're competing with a whole bank of ads. So you've got to yell. Most people, it's on in the background. You're not actually listening. So we've been over this before, but it's a different way of listening when you're listening to a podcast. And I think that's why now with the analytics and other ways of measuring, it's a medium that advertisers should be looking at in conjunction with other traditional forms of advertising. And Andy talked about that, about the difference between traditional and digital and what you can do on Facebook and what you can't do. So there's limitations with all forms of advertising.
That's right. But the real estate in a podcast is so precious. With radio, as you say, you might hear 20, 30 ads in 1 hour of radio, but a podcast, you might hear 1 or 2. And so that's where the recall can come from. So it's much more targeted with a podcast.
But then, Chris, there's branded podcasts, which are a bit different to your traditional podcast that has a host-read ad. A brand probably wouldn't put an ad in their own podcast because their brand's wrapped around the outside of the whole thing. So
yeah, well, with a podcast, you've got to be as less intrusive as you possibly can. Now, if it's not a branded podcast, an ad has got to be positioned in the podcast somehow. But with a branded podcast, you barely need to say much at all. Listeners understand that it comes from your brand. That's enough. They're taking time out to listen to the content that you're producing, so you can go easy on, with music and ads and all that sort of stuff. If it's relevant, if there's an offer at the end, chuck that in.
And the brands doing it now are getting great PR because when people like us talk about it, we're talking about GE, Tinder, eBay, Hootsuite, because the list isn't 100 long. So right now, the brands that are doing it are getting extra bang for their buck because people are talking about it.
Absolutely.
Well, I think that's it for episode 18 of Be Podcasting. If you're listening on our website and haven't subscribed yet, make sure you do in one of the many, many podcast apps out there now so you don't miss an episode. And for those using Apple Podcasts, we'd really appreciate you writing a review so others may find us. For more about us, you can go to be.com.au. We've been helping brands of all sizes create audio to communicate their messages for more than 3 decades, and we'd love to discuss working with you. From all of us at Be Media Production, thanks so much for listening.
Be Podcasting is produced by the team at Be Media Production. Managing Director Nick Schildberger, Executive Producer Heather Dawson, Producer Chris Ashmore, and I'm Peter Letts, Director of Audio. For more about us, go to be.com.au.